When horror movie critics posted their traditional online end-of-year lists for 2023, chances are you saw one particular movie crop up a bunch. Brandon Cronenberg's latest film, Infinity Pool. Set on the fictional island of Letulka and shot in Hungary and Croatia, Infinity Pool orbits around two key ideas: the protective matrix of privilege and humanity's thirst for validation. Those are both extremely complex and heavy topics that could fill a movie on their own. In an attempt to tackle both of these issues, Infinity Pool only succeeds at covering one with the appropriate amount of psychological detail, while its attempts at covering the other topic, well, we'll get into it. If you haven't seen the movie yet, this review is going to be packed with spoilers. We're not going to show you everything, but if you have not already seen the movie, now's your chance to pause this video and do so. Ready? Let's dive in. Our movie opens up on a conversation between Sad Rider Man James Foster, played by Alexander Skarsgård, of Being a Skarsgård fame, and his wife Em, played by Australian actress Cleopatra Coleman. The couple's relationship is a bit on the rocks as a result of James's truly awful case of writer's block that has been going on for the past 6 years. Em, the daughter of a wealthy publisher, feels like she's been carrying the weight in the relationship and is accompanying James to the island of Letulka as he searches for inspiration for his next book. The couple soon meets another married couple at their resort and strike up a friendship. There's Gabby, an actress who specializes in commercial acting, and her husband Albin, a Swiss architect. When Gabby shares that she's read James's book and is looking forward to the next one, it only deepens the rift between James and Em. James, however, flattered by Gabby's adoration, takes the opportunity to get to know the couple better during an unsanctioned trip outside the resort. The two couples enjoy their secret trip to a remote beach where they get their drink on. On the way back, James is the only one fit to drive, and even he's a little smizzed. He starts driving and partway back to the resort, bam! He hits a farmer named Myro Myron, waking everyone in the car. James and Em want to call the local police, but Gabby and Albin inform them that this would result in painful consequences for all involved, and suggest that they should go back to the resort and handle it in the morning. In the morning, James and Em awake to a knock at their door, where they're greeted by Letulkan police officers. The police officers take them to a government building, where they're separated, and James is informed that the crime he has committed is punishable by execution, per the island's traditions. But there's a caveat. The officer tells James about the revised process of Doubles Act for international visitors and diplomats, a law wherein a tourist can pay to have a clone or double of themselves executed in their stead. These clones are identical to the individual criminal and even have the same memories, and it's a requirement of the law to have the original person watch their double get murked. It's revealed that the purpose of this law is to keep tourism alive and prevent an international incident, despite the conservative indigenous traditions of the native Letulkans. James agrees to be duplicated, and he and Em watch as his double calls out Em's name, while the farmer's son carries out the ritual execution. Em, naturally, is horrified by the whole situation, while James watches the scene unfold with fascination. When Em gets back to the resort, she starts packing because she's distressed and ready to get the fuck out of Letulka. But there's a new problem. James can't find his passport, so they end up staying another night. That night, James goes to tell the front desk that he's having trouble finding his passport, but decides instead to extend his stay at the resort for another week on Em's dime. While at the front desk, he's approached by Gabby, who invites him to join what I'm calling the Crazy Clone Club, a group of rich tourists that use the island and its people as their personal playground. Each member has been through what James just experienced and seen their doubles murdered. Through a series of escalating games of violence and depravity, James becomes inducted into this fucked up little circle. Em, on the other hand, rightfully decides to leave after she's discovered he's extended their stay. And good for her, getting out of there. The last game that the Crazy Clone Club plays starts out as a raid on a government hospital and ends with James discovering that they've tricked him into beating up a double of himself that they made in secret. The Crazy Clone Club sees this as a hilarious prank, but James sees this as a wake-up call. It's revealed that James hid his passport intentionally in order to stay at the resort. He retrieves it from its hiding place and proceeds to make moves to leave, because he's straight up no longer having a good time. He hops on the bus to the airport, but his voyage is cut short by who else? the Crazy Clone Club, who threaten to kill everyone on the bus if he doesn't come out. The Crazy Clone Club continues to threaten his life until he's finally able to escape, but not before being shot in the leg. James is saved by 2 Latolkien women, but wakes up to find the Crazy Clone Club has one more initiation ritual in mind. James must take the life of his double. James resists until his double begins to attack him, but ultimately he wins out. In the end, he earns the respect of the Crazy Clone Club members, who now see him as one of their own. James makes one more attempt to return home to the life he once knew, but finds that he can't. He is a different person now that he's seen himself die, like multiple times, and killed himself with his own 2 hands. He's no longer the same James that walked into the resort with Em. Our story ends with James alone in the empty resort as rain pours from the sky, incapable of moving on or moving forward. Infinity Pool's got a lot going for it. For one thing, it's fucking gorgeous. As contemporary horror movies shot on digital cameras go, it's doing some really interesting stuff with light, color, and composition that's allegedly fooled some people into thinking it was shot on film. Shout out to Kareem Hussein for his great work as the DP. This is just really bold stuff that you won't see anywhere else. From the shots that flow from canted angles into full camera rotations to the strategic use of light and color that enhances the mood of each scene. However, what's especially striking are the off-putting close-ups. Faces are relegated to the edge of the frame, and characters in conversation are shown to be facing away from one another, depicting a deep isolation and emphasizing the emotional disconnect between characters. The boldness of the cinematography is only matched by the fierceness of the editing. James Van de Water and his team make exacting cuts that are critical to maintaining the mood of unease in key scenes, but have no problem playing fast and loose with the material during the film's numerous hallucination sequences. Tying the beautiful shots and their corresponding cutting patterns together is Tim Hecker's incredible score. It's got creepy, atonal moments, but also quiet ambient ones that make the characters feel like they're drowning in sounds. It's a tool that succeeded in keeping me immersed in the action of the movie and encouraged me to pay attention to some of the quieter, more contemplative moments. In an interview for the podcast, The Film Scorer, Hecker revealed that some of the strange sounds you hear on the soundtrack are manipulated samples of Mediterranean cicadas he found on YouTube. It's little details like that which make the score feel really unique. Overall, Infinity Pool is pretty shocking on your first watch, and if we're being real here, it's still distressing on the rewatch. Editing moments like cutting from a hail of gunfire to an imitation of a Bollywood dance performance are provocative and grab your attention right from the jump. There are these moments that linger. One such moment is when the Crazy Clone Club sits in the government building expressing their discontent with the bureaucracy of execution. The officer, fed up with their whining, orders them to be killed, only for it to be revealed to us as the audience that the conversation we saw was being held by the unknowing doubles. When the camera pans to the cheering club members and then back to the dying doubles we saw talking earlier, there's no other word for it than shocking. Another such moment is the neon orgy. There's a drug-fueled neon orgy, and we will not speak any further about the unsettling nature of the drug-fueled neon orgy. Shock value is called that for a reason. Shock as a sensation can be valuable. It reminds us that we haven't seen everything yet, and that there are still ideas that can touch us in ways we don't expect. Lastly, let's talk about Skarsgård. His performance as the main character, James Foster, who in an interview with Dazed Digital he called a broken man, is excellent. James is all negative traits. He's weak-willed, broke as fuck, he confuses M's generosity for emasculation, and he's all too eager to do anything to look down on others. He's like an even scarier version of Jake Lacey's character from The White Lotus. Not the guy you'd expect to ice someone until he does it, and then you're like, oh yeah, right, you had that in you all along. There's no edge he has to go over. He can go home at any time, yet he pushes himself to follow his worst impulses, even with all the right tools in front of him, but he can't find it within himself to learn from his failures. And the world doesn't expect him to learn, so why would he? Skarsgård captures the character's essence first through empty looks and subtle micro-expressions, and later through a theatrical, highly involved, and physical performance that makes perfect use of his lithe, 6'4" frame. This is a performance you can feel, and you can even feel James's own false confidence in larger, showier gestures. the skin beneath the skin, as he desperately tries to gain the approval of the Crazy Clone Club. Look at the 1,000-yard stare he gives on his final trip to the airport. He's empty. He has nothing left in him. James's downward trajectory that ends in his admission of powerlessness is the result of an earlier realization that he can be subject to the same violence he perpetrates. Infinity Pool is a violent movie, and it has to be by design. The tentpole moments in James's search for validation are all centered around acts of violence, which start off as accidental and end up as horrifyingly deliberate. Let's go right to the beginning. The only reason James finds out about the doubling law is because he commits vehicular manslaughter after partying on the beach with Albin and Gabby, the latter of whom expresses how much of a fan she is of James's novel. When the farmer's son murders James's double, his look starts as one of fascination, but grows into downright revelry. Gabby and the other members of the Crazy Clone Club talk at length about witnessing how such an act made them all feel renewed, and that James's own satisfaction makes him one of them. The Crazy Clone Club promises James an avenue to an in-group, one that maintains their feeling of dominance through violence. They're rich, confident, and dominate their environment, and they convince him that he can be one of them, and he falls for it. The Crazy Clone Club first tests his mettle when they break into the house of a Latolkan government official. They give him a handgun, which he holds but fails to shoot. Gabby attempts to entice him into committing murder, but is unsuccessful due to James's trepidation and her husband Albin's interruption during an especially tense moment. The fallout from the break-in results in the second of James's doubles getting killed. The club moves on to their next test, a raid of a government hospital. James is again given a gun and tasked with the job of lookout. He hypes himself up and practices aiming. However, when a van comes by with Latolkan officials, he chooses to jump out of their way rather than take aim at the vehicle. When the Crazy Clone Club brings their hostage to James, they egg him on to exact vengeance on their bound, gagged, and masked kidnappee, under the delusion that he will be beating up the official who denied him his new passport. In this moment, James revels in the violence, and he feels safe doing so. His victim has no ability to fight back, nor can he see his tormentor. But James is in an environment where he is surrounded by people who can provide him with positive feedback. He doesn't need to hype himself up in that moment. He does not need to think about his own opinions of himself. He is the center of attention, something he's always wanted. Praise, adulation, positive feedback. When the mask is ripped off, James discovers that the Crazy Clone Club has tricked him into harming a clone of himself. This is the first intentional act of violence James commits, and it's technically on himself. The Crazy Clone Club doesn't care about James or his doubles. They view the whole situation as entertainment, just a silly prank. For James, he has been satisfied by watching the violence occur to a version of himself and even to other people, but being directly responsible all of a sudden makes him feel culpable and makes the danger feel real. He believed that the violence would liberate him from his cowardice, but in reality, he was deluded into believing that he himself could be powerful by virtue of being in close proximity to other powerful people, all while not realizing that he would experience the same shame that comes with committing violent acts. It's one thing if the violent acts you commit impact people you don't know, even if you're participating indirectly, but to do it to oneself? To see the consequences of your actions affect your own life, and in this case, your own face and body, can act as a wake-up call. Some people have to see themselves as the victim to see what damage has been done to the lives of others. When James realizes that the people he thought were his friends don't actually value his life, he tries to get the fuck out of Latolka without telling anyone. This is when the Crazy Clone Club reveals that they are willing to enact violence against James. Not a double this time, the original. The Crazy Clone Club has been picking out weak tourists and targeting them to satisfy their appetite for violence, no longer satisfied with just killing natives. James realizes that their intentions are far different from his own. Where he has been trying to fill a void by wanting to feel strong, their appetite for violence is innate and motivated by nothing. It's utterly nihilistic and unyielding. But that isn't even what bothers James the most. He's sad that they didn't read his fucking book. None of this other shit would have happened if his book had done well, and if Gabby hadn't pretended to be a fan of his work. James was emboldened watching his clone be executed. In those moments where James saw himself fighting back with his last breaths, he sees a version of himself that was neither weak nor a failure. He felt superior to the version of himself that died at the hands of the state of Latolka. He felt invincible just by living. He felt liberated from his failure, and he began to act as a critic instead of as a person being criticized. He's more upset by the fact that they served him up a false sense of validation to ensure he would go along with their antics. He never would have entertained this otherwise. The Crazy Clone Club's plan for James is to turn him into one of them, to indoctrinate him into their cult of violence through a challenge that will determine whether or not he lives or dies, and whether or not he will be the same person he was before stepping foot on the island. James refuses the call to violence. Only when he is pushed to choose between his life and the life of his feral double that attacks him does he choose to save himself. The Crazy Clone Club sees this as a sort of rebirth. In this final act of murder, James has expanded his own capacity for violence, but he doesn't feel better off for it. He couldn't confront his failures until he was forced to do so at gunpoint. Sure, he may feel strong, but he doesn't feel empowered to change his circumstances, which is the only reason he was in Latolka to begin with. Bro hasn't written one word. Joining this community did not grant James a new lease on life, nor did the violence they perpetuated. He is instead paralyzed, and his refusal to accept negative criticism prevents him from moving forward. That last shot captures James in a passionless state. He's numbed himself. In expanding his capacity for violence, he has diminished his own capacity for empathy. Infinity Pool doesn't have an image that corresponds to the idea of empowerment because it comes from within. James doesn't believe he has anyone who believes in him, and thus falls victim to the whims of the first people who come along, which, in this case, were a group of violent maniacs. Had anyone else approached him with something nice to say, he would have gone with them instead. He was so desperate for their approval and lacked so much confidence in his abilities that he was willing and able to go along with actions that warped his own sense of morality and stripped him of his creativity and empathy. James conflates criticism with violence in the moment when he is forced to listen to a bad review of his first novel and chooses to face real violence instead of a negative critique. He never moves past the negative criticism, even by the time the credits roll. The violence in Infinity Pool is not about the violence, it's about needing to be needed, validated. The movie expresses the ease with which someone vulnerable who is looking for a sense of purpose can find it in exchange for their morality. However, all of this was overshadowed by the movie's second theme. Infinity Pool thinks it has a lot to say about wealth and privilege. The resort setting in particular is the target of the screenplay's critiques, it being a place where people from wealthier countries come to entertain themselves in a self-contained development away from the ceaseless rhythm of their everyday lives, while the country's native people do not have the ability to enjoy the same benefits. Everything we learn about Latolka is from the perspective of the people in the tourism industry, non-natives, and government officials, none of whom have any vested interest in sharing accounts of real life in this country. We first learn that the town that houses the resort does not represent the real culture of its people. James comments on how Chinese food is offered to guests, and then considers how attending that same inauthentic resort setting is pathetic, and does not offer a viable source of inspiration for his next book. At the resort, the Latolkans who work there have to wear traditional garb of other cultures as the totems and talismans of their own culture get repackaged as consumer goods. The first third of the movie even sets up the conflict between tourists and the native Latolkans in a number of ways, setting the audience up to expect that the Latolkans will play a major role in the film's story. Gabby and James first meet during a scene where Latolkans riding ATVs chase tourists off the beach, clearly unhappy with having them on their land. The tourist characters also make a big deal about the gate around the resort, which is said to be a protective measure, thereby implying that the native people of Latolka are a threat, even at the baseline level without additional provocation. The gate is part of the resort's stated rules, all of which are designed to separate the tourists from the native people of Latolka. Tourists are required to show their IDs at the gate, they're not allowed to rent cars, they can enjoy themselves, just within the limits of the resort. Government officials tell James that the indigenous values tend towards the conservative and don't mesh with the values held by the island's tourists. Their death penalty for murders also extends to people who commit manslaughter, sodomy, or even public disturbances. The people of Latolka believe that a family's firstborn son should participate in ritual execution, and it's a position enforced by their government, who state in the film that it's rooted in long-standing cultural tradition. Of course, James is appalled to hear that a child is going to have to kill him in a ritualistic murder for his accidental crime of manslaughter. Then again, the government only upholds this idea on a technicality, by way of the whole doubling thing. And the movie makes you think that all of this will culminate in a sort of massive collision. But ultimately, the moment when James hits Myron is the beginning of the end of James's engagement with the Latolkien people. After that point, he dreams of the boy who killed his double. He is saved by two Latolkien women who do not speak and engages exclusively with Latolkien government officials. Meanwhile, the Latolkien rebels completely disappear. From that moment forward, we don't see any Latolkien who disagrees with the system as it's set up. The vacationers go through the gate at will, and we do not see any clashing values between the Latolkien people and the tourists. The most we see is the corruption of the Latolkien government officials, who are living lavishly and engaging in sex acts that we can assume do not align with the native cultural values. For the rest of the film, the clash that we see is exclusively the racism and sense of superiority shared by the tourists. The only value the tourists find in Latolka is their ability to vacation there, where the Crazy Clone Club finds value in the ability to commit crimes without consequence. We see this through the club's dehumanization of the Latolkians in moments when Gabby refers to them as animals. That extends to a lack of respect for their traditional cultural practices as they steal the traditional masks to use as disguises during their break-in. Moreover, we see their view of the Latolkien system as fundamentally unserious when they complain about being inconvenienced by being held longer than usual. The film shows the Latolkien justice system failing the native Latolkians by offering them a false sense of justice. There's a pretense of following the native cultural traditions by having the double have the guilty party's memories, but this performance of tradition only serves to demonstrate the lack of care the government has for the people. Even the government has values that are out of step with the beliefs of the Latolkien people as they appeal to the foreigners with money by giving tourists an opportunity to pay their way out of crimes. James, when he is first cloned, takes out his wallet and card and visits an ATM to withdraw money to pay for the cloning process. And we are even privy to the fact that this isn't even James's own money, it's M's. The film sets up that James is privileged, but he is not wealthy. The savvy viewer will believe that James is being set up to be killed when he runs out of money, but that moment never actually comes. Unfortunately, the film goes in a completely different direction. To be honest, the film draws a connection between James's access to wealth and his ability to act outside the law, but doesn't actually deliver on the relationship between his account balance and accountability. James continues to participate in heinous acts, but his consequences are immaterial. And granted, when people are privileged, that is the way things go. But that's a point the film lets go by the wayside a little too quickly. The trouble is, James's story and his experiences have almost nothing to do with the island, its people, or even the concept of tourism. Instead of tackling an important conversation about systems of justice and the relationship between governments, their people, and tourists, it wound up being more about how money is successful at shielding people from consequences. It would have been cool to see the Latolkien rebels make an effort to stop the Crazy Clone Club, for the government officials to be fed up with their antics, or even to witness Myron's son exact his vengeance. We don't even know how much the native Latolkians know about the tourist's loophole. In focusing on James, we really lose out on the more interesting global perspective. Somehow, the story lost something in its specificity. In the end, Infinity Pool is one sad rich man's story about how he dealt with the haters. It has no trouble discussing the dangers of seeking validation, but doesn't deliver in the same way when discussing the way wealth and access shield people from growth and consequences. Still, its magnetic lead performance, sumptuous visuals, whip-smart editing, and unnerving score will linger in your mind for days or even weeks afterward, and stir up plenty of discussion. While I enjoyed the movie, there were signs of a better, more focused project with a more important message. I think it's best to go into Infinity Pool knowing that it's art coming from a personal perspective as opposed to a globally minded one. And, to its credit, the film delivers on telling the story of James's violent search for validation without getting hung up on the technicalities of its science fiction. Good movie. It's kinda batshit, but that's probably what Bro was going for. Cronenberg and all. Thanks for watching. emdashtrash